Good afternoon and welcome to the National Adoption Competency Mental Health Training Initiative, or NTI, Transfer of Learning Tuesdays. Today's webinar is entitled Race Matters, Part 2, Addressing Racial Bias in Transracial and Transcultural Adoption. So this is Part 3 of our NTI Transfer of Learning series. I am Edna Davis Brown, an implementation specialist for the NTI at the Center for Adoption Support and Education, CASE. My co-presenters are Lisa Maynard, also an NTI implementation specialist, and Tony Hines, training specialist for CASE. So you'll be hearing obviously from Tony and Lisa. Now, I know that you've indicated that you're from certain agencies in certain cities, so we want to get a global view of where you guys are from in terms of your region. So what area of the United States do you reside or work? If you can indicate that in the poll, and if there's another region or possibly another country, indicate that as other and tell us in the chat where that is. So I'll give you a couple of minutes. We want to get a bird's eye view of where you work and reside. Because we know that there were quite a few folks who registered. Oh, we have someone from Nova Scotia, Canada. Welcome. I absolutely love Canada. Colorado, people are indicating things in the chat. Let's see what we have here. Quite a few from the Midwest. You guys are from all across the country. Another person from Nova Scotia. Welcome. Quite a few from the Midwest here again, and the Southeast. Thank you so much for joining us today. So if we can go to the next slide, we've got more people from Nova Scotia. Wow. Glad you're here to share with us and be a part of this webinar. So what we're going to cover today, I'll cover the objectives in a moment. We will do an overview of NTI. Now, we recognize that there are some of you who are already familiar with NTI. Maybe you're taking the courses or you've completed the course, but we want to at least expose NTI to those who maybe have not heard our overview of NTI. And further, we want you to be able to do some elevator speeches with folks in your networks or your colleagues to share more information. So we'll give you a review of NTI. We'll talk about significant issues in transracial adoption. We'll focus on disproportionality, dueling loyalties, microaggressions, and a whole lot more. And one key piece is that we'll discuss the role of child welfare and mental health professionals in addressing race. And finally, we want to give you information about how to access NTI and some implementation options. So next slide. So we want to know even a little bit more about you. I know that you've shared this already, but use your chat box to tell us what best describes your current role. And you may have multiple options. Sometimes we wear multiple hats. So feel free to indicate more than one option in terms of your current role. And we've got folks putting things in the chat as well. Child welfare specialist, county case manager, parent mentor. Love having the parents on this webinar, adoption specialist, behavioral health, an RN and a parent, kinship navigators, such a broad audience, foster care navigators. And let's see what we have here. A cross section, quite a few case managers, lots of social workers, therapists, administrators, quite a few cross-sectional professionals. So wonderful. Thank you so much for your participation in the polls and continuing to indicate information in the chat box. So let's talk a little bit about the Center for Adoption Support and Education. We're based out of Burtonsville, Maryland, with offices in other areas. It was created, CASE was created in 1998 to provide post-adoption counseling and education services to families in Maryland, Northern Virginia, and Washington, D.C. It's a private nonprofit organization or services agency envisioning that everyone touched by foster care and adoption has access to adoption competent support necessary to navigate this lifelong journey. The NTI, I'm going to refer to it as that from now on, builds upon the firm foundation of unique expertise, and core values of CASE. To learn more about CASE, our mission, our goals, our activities, etc., please visit us at www.adoptionsupport.org. And through our work, we've seen a need for a change in how we address the mental health needs of children. The Children's Bureau grant was an opportunity to help us address these gaps. So next slide. So you have lots of information here. So here are some highlights about NTI. It was funded through a 5-year cooperative agreement, a research initiative with the Children's Bureau. So our charge was to create state-of-the-art web-based trainings for child welfare and mental health professionals, and to enhance the capacity of professionals to understand and address the mental health challenges of children and youth in foster, adoption, and guardianship. Next slide. And you'll notice in the chat box, Gary is putting in links to more information. We've been using wonderful nationally recognized experts. We led a core team of experts in curriculum development, web-based production, and evaluation to oversee the development of NTI trainings. And we work collaboratively with an advisory council of nationally recognized experts, including foster and adoptive parents, former foster youth, etc., to develop the competencies as a foundation for this particular curriculum. You may recognize some of the folks here pictured here, including Dr. Joseph Crumbly, top left, family therapist, consultant, and author of Transracial Adoption and Foster Care Practice Issues for Professionals. Terry Cross, founding and executive director of NICWA, now serving as a senior advisor. He is author of Positive Indian Parenting and co-authored Towards a Culturally Competent System of Care. And Dr. Ruth McCoy, professor emerita, Boston College School of Social Work. So a number of partnerships are also in place to provide subject matter expertise and support for training, implementation, and dissemination. For more information on all of these partnerships, advisory groups, visit us again at www.adoptionsupport.org/NTI. So Lisa, tell us about adoption and what the actual research says.
Sure. So thank you so much, Edna. For most children, adoption itself is a significant protective factor, bringing permanency, safety, nurturing to the environment where children generally have been in less than adequate situations, right? They don't come into the child welfare system if they've been in safe and stable homes. But even so, the incidence of emotional behavioral problems is 3 to 6 times higher for youth in foster care than those in non-custodial placements. And you can see some of the statistics here. The American Academy of Pediatrics identifies mental health and behavioral health as the greatest unmet need for children in care. This was particularly surprising and eye-opening in somewhat disturbing to us when we looked up the statistics most recently. Up to 80% of children and adolescents enter the system with a significant mental health need compared to 18 to 22% of the general population. And there's the research study that talks about that. So great need in this population, right? So NTI was created and developed to address these issues, to give child welfare and mental health professionals a real foundational standing in the issues about adoption and foster care. There are two different curriculum, very highly aligned. The child welfare curriculum is 20 hours with an additional 5 hours for supervisors. The mental health curriculum is 30 hours with some options for coaching sessions. There are 8 modules in the child welfare curriculum and 10 modules in the mental health curriculum. As I said, they're very well aligned, and the mental health curriculum's 2 additional modules are focused on new assessment strategies, treatment, adoption through adoption lens, much more clinically focused. The child welfare curriculum is approved by NASW for 20 hours for the staff and 25 hours for supervisors for continuing education credits. And the mental health curriculum is approved by NASW for 25 continuing education credits. I don't think we've said this yet. For those who are new to NTI, NTI is web-based, self-paced, and free. So if you log on to our learning management system to enroll in and complete the trainings, you will get the CEUs for free. So yeah, that's a really big deal, right? This is an overview of our modules. As I said, there are 8 modules in the child welfare and 10 in mental health. Assessment and treatment planning, therapeutic parenting strategies are the 2 additional ones in mental health. But again, very much aligned, a lot of the same information, but in the mental health training, we just sort of dig deeper and look at the issues more from a more clinical focus. And today we're going to talk about race and diversity, right? We're going to focus on that module. So disproportionality, we're going to talk a little bit about that because that is, it really is a significant factor in child welfare. Disproportionality refers to a group's representation in a particular category that exceeds expectations for that group or that differs substantially from representation in the other category. So African American children are more likely than the general child population to be represented in foster care. And once there, they're more likely to remain for longer periods of time. American Indian children are less likely to be placed outside their home. And youth of color experience longer stays in foster care and much more restrictive placements than their counterparts. So thinking about institutional care. Group homes, residential placements, and so on. NTI addresses race. Our experiences create the foundation for our biases. Everyone has them to some degree or another. I have them, you have them, we all have them. And it's important to pay attention to biases so that we can consciously maintain neutrality in our work. We don't want to bring the biases into our work and then make an assessment or a treatment plan based on our own personal biases. As a child welfare professional, you have an obligation to acknowledge, encourage, and promote the identities of children and youth with whom you work and for whom you are making really life-altering decisions. We're going to talk today about transracial and transcultural adoption. It's addressed in NTI, international adoption, infant adoption, child welfare adoption. I'm a real fan of this slide because this is a picture of me and my little guy. I'm an adoptive parent. My children were born in South Korea. They're now 31 this this little guy is 34 now somehow. But we really want to talk about the preconceived ideas and the biases and how they impact the child and family in transracial, transcultural adoption. We want to talk about the role of the child welfare and mental health providers. How do we best support children and families in these families, in these placements, giving them all the supports that they need. So Tony, I think you're going to take it from here.
Yes, thanks so much, Lisa. And so Lisa is an interracial adoptive parent, and I am an interracial adoptee. I was adopted in Washington, D.C. by 2 white parents. I also happen to be 2 white same-sex parents. So I'm an interracial adoptee in a family that's an LGBTQ headed household too. So one of the things that I just wanted to jump in here and say is that you'll hear me say interracial adoption and interracial adoptee a lot as I'm speaking here. And the reason that I'm doing that is because really for 2 reasons. One is related to a short story that I'll tell you now. A few years ago, I was in a classroom and they asked us, tell us something interesting about yourself. And so we went around the room and I said, well, my name is Tony and I'm a transracial adoptee and this is part of my story, etc. At the end of that class period, a peer came up to me and she said, so transracial adoptee, does that mean that you want to be white? And I said, no, this is what it means. Here is what being a transracial adoptee means. It simply means being of a different race than the family that you're adopted by. But I learned that sometimes there's confusion there about the terminology that exists for this specific population. The other reason is because in doing some of my own research, I'm a PhD student and I do research on interracial adoption too. The other reason is because in doing that research, I discovered that the term transracial adoption was really a term that was coined in the 60s and 70s, mainly by child welfare professionals and also by adoptive parents who were envisioning this post-racial society where we would be transitioning out of this idea of race being an important thing that we needed to discuss in the family environment. So really this introduction of the colorblind rearing strategy. And today we know kind of the fallacies of colorblind rearing strategies too. And so I felt that interracial was a more accurate term for me in describing that. However, I acknowledge that transracial adoption is the popular term, and for algorithm purposes, it makes sense for us as an organization to use this term. But for me personally, that's why I prefer to use the term interracial adoptee. So sorry, Lisa, I jumped the gun there. I wanted to ask a question here to start off, and please drop it off in the chat, or please drop your answers off in the chat. So what are some of the challenges you feel interracial adoptive families might face? These answers can be a sentence, a word. Just put them in the chat because we want to hear how you're feeling about that. Identity formation, right? Cultural differences, definitely. Judgment, I'm saying, that's a good one. A big one in my community is dealing with hair, also a good one. Loss, culture. Discrimination, hair, stereotypes, prejudice, feeling a sense of belonging, choices, not understanding the importance of being part of a community different than parents. Danger, microaggression, identity issues, recognizing race is not one single color, being labeled, fear of their own race. Yes, and we'll talk a bit about that. So thank you. Thank you for all of those great responses. So given that, I wanted to jump into the next slide here. And one that we touched upon kind of in some of those answers, but didn't go into deep detail about, was this kind of idea of dueling loyalties. So dueling loyalties to racial groups, and this loyalty that they have both to the races that they're members of and also to their adoptive parents' race, are things that interracial adoptees are often examining, thinking about, and processing as they're going forward throughout their life course. So, for example, there's a Black interracial adoptee. They're interacting with their peer group, who, in this particular instance, is a predominantly Black peer group. And somewhere in that conversation, the phrase, the sentence is uttered, "Man, I can't stand white people. I dislike white people. They're the worst." So in that interaction, the adoptee has a choice to make. Do they agree with that statement verbally? Do they say something in agreement? Do they remain silent? Or do they push back against that statement and say, you know, not all white people are like this? So making that split-second decision is really something that's triggering for the interracial adoptee and this idea of dueling loyalties. Because on the one hand, oftentimes they're raised by great parents, right, who love them, who support them, and who may talk about race in the household. So they may be of the mindset, no, not all white people are like this. But they know that if they say that during this instance, this may cause separation from them, from the rest of their peer group, who may now view them as less racially authentic individuals than people that were raised in same race households. And they may also feel a disloyalty to their racial groups because they're in defense of a group who, members of their peer group who happen to be members of their same race in this instance, are not defending or are actually proponents of kind of on the other side of things in that regard. This example doesn't happen all the time. It does happen though. But this idea of, okay, if I don't understand something, if I don't feel the same way as my peers who are my same race about this specific subject, am I being disloyal to them? If I live in a predominantly white community that I'm actually happy to be in, meaning I like my friends, I like my school, have I forsaken other members of my racial group? And we'll also talk a little bit about, you know, am I being disloyal to my birth family if I feel close to this tight-knit community I live in, which happens to be predominantly white for a lot of the cases that we're seeing in these interracial households. And we also know that interracial adoptees are really dealing with this space in between. It's again, a feeling of not feeling authentic as a member of one's own race, but also aware of their non-white status and really facing prejudice from all sides. So knowing that if they're playing in their community environment, I've heard several stories of interracial adoptees who were doing a driving test with their mom. They were just driving around the block. And then a neighbor calls the cops on them because the neighbor says, well, this person of color over here, did they kidnap this white woman and did they steal her car? Is this a hostage situation? Is this a situation when they're out and about where the adoptive parent is questioned on whether they've kidnapped the child? And also the microaggressions that are going on at school, in the community, within the family structure, within the extended family structure. So knowing that they don't feel fully accepted a lot of times by white parents who they're predominantly going to be raised by, but also sometimes by members of their own race who see in them a difference from them because of their upbringing versus their upbringing. So these are all also common challenges that the interracial adoptee is facing. And we can move to the next slide. So more in this space in between that the interracial adoptee is often feeling and experiencing. A lot of times we hear positive racial representation, books in the household, shows that they need to watch that have characters of their same races, going to school with kids who look like them, having teachers who look like them. All of these things are extremely important for the interracial adoptee to have in their life, for the interracial adoptive family to have in their life. But you know what? These things are not enough. They're not enough. As an interracial adoptee, I grew up and I interacted sometimes with members of my peer group who were also Black. And then out of the blue, someone would say, do you remember when church service and they did this? Or did you remember when we saw people catching, the Holy Ghost in church? Do you remember when our parents were playing the Isley Brothers in the household? So there are things there that I didn't have a memory of because my immediate family did not do those things. And there was no level of church services that they could have attended that could have given me the story of my Black mom did this as well in relation to my peers and having that conversation with them. So in those moments, I often remained quiet because I realized that, one, I was really learning a bit from their experiences about what were some common experiences. And two, I didn't have those experiences, so there was nothing for me to say in these moments. So even though I had those, quote, racial mirrors, those representations around me, people who resembled my race, even though I read up on the historical books and I knew all these facts about the civil rights movement, and I knew all this stuff about Langston Hughes, who I revered, that wasn't enough to make me feel, one, authentically Black in those moments, and also wasn't enough to give me the same, it seemed almost innate knowledge that my peers had who existed in these same race households. So I say this to say that we need to begin to talk to our families about the importance of affirming bicultural identities. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is my last name happens to be Hines, Tony Hines. That's the last name of one of my adoptive parents. While I don't feel that I, of course, am, an Irish individual, and I identify first and foremost as Black, I do feel a connection to the last name Hines, to my mom who has Irish ancestry, and to parts of her culture that she brought into the household. She wasn't shy about playing Irish music in the household sometimes when I was growing up. She wasn't shy about talking about Irish people, about the last name Hines. So it's a last name now that I take pride in having, and even passing down to my children and talking to them about what it means. And it's also something that made me feel more a part of my own family, more a part of my adoptive family. In this way, I wasn't being othered in my household. I wasn't being told, all right, you go learn everything you need to learn about Black people, and we're just not going to learn anything about our own cultural histories or heritage. You're going to be the only one in our household who's doing that work. We're going to be doing that work, but only as it relates to your race, not our race and ethnicity too. So when talking to families, really encourage them to take ancestry DNA tests, to recognize their own cultural histories, to talk about their family histories if they don't know about it, to read more about it, to watch more television shows about people from Poland or people from Ireland, because it's really telling the adoptee, hey, it's okay for you to identify, yes, as your race, but to also to kind of have this bicultural existence, because that is the type of household that you're growing up in too. And we can move to the next slide, Lisa. So thank you. So I wanted to talk about the one drop rule, mixed race identities, and colorism, which is akin in some ways to what we were talking about just now. So the one drop rule in the late 19th and early 20th century asserted that any person with even one ancestor of Black ancestry, one drop of Black blood, is considered Black. And so we can actually move to the next slide. So I wanted to put a quote up here from, and it was actually Lisa, by the way, so props to her, who found this wonderful quote from Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes said, "You see, unfortunately, I am not Black. There are lots of different kinds of blood in our family, but here in the United States, the word Negro is used to mean anyone who has any Negro blood at all in his veins." So I think what Langston is really wrestling here with is, again, feelings of not feeling authentically Black as a mixed race person now. So this connects to interracial adoption, because in a lot of the adoptions that we see, specifically of Latinx and Black populations, interracial adoptees are also mixed race adoptees. And so we see in a lot of these kids that they feel as though they're forced to kind of choose one racial identity to belong to. They're not allowed to choose both. But at the same time, they know that they're not white because they're not seen by society as a white individual, unless they are, quote, white passing in their skin color and their characteristics. And even then, once people find out that they have, quote, blood of people of color in their veins, then they are often treated differently. And so it's really important that we have role models for our kids who are mixed race. It's really important that we acknowledge, as Lisa was talking about earlier, some of the biases that have existed in the child welfare system as it relates to race, racial complexities. We know now that darker skinned children are the least likely children to be adopted interracially. We know that when Black children, for example, are adopted interracially, that there's a disproportionate amount of mixed race Black children who are growing up in interracial households. So as professionals, that means for us, one, acknowledging that these things have gone on, but also being aware of that in our own practice and making sure that we're not replicating some of the things, some of the systemic biases that have existed in our system. And so it's really impactful when we do that. And it's also really impactful when we talk to families about mixed race identities. When we do have a family who we're placing a mixed race child in or with, it's important that we talk to the family about having mixed race role models for kids to look up to too, right? So we have plenty of mixed race individuals in society who are these positive role models for our kids to look up to. There's Tiger Woods, who's Black and Asian. There's Naomi Osaka now, who's also Black and Asian. There's politicians a lot of times who are Black and white. Barack Obama being probably the most famous example of a politician who is a mixed race individual, but whose society often is categorized as Black. But as we're talking to our kids, it's important to acknowledge that yes, Barack Obama is Black, but he's also mixed race. He has a white mom, like you may have a white mom. And he embraces all of his culture in that way. And it's important for our kids to know that it's okay for them to do that and to affirm them in this way. And so in the same way that the interracial adoptee, who may appear monoracial, not mixed race, feels that they may have to choose, I see someone put a dual identity status. That is exactly what is going on for the mixed race child too. They're also feeling that they have this dual identity status, but it's the dual identity of being an interracial adoptee and also being a mixed race child and having to choose kind of twice in that way. So I have, if I were a mixed race person, I have to have those dueling sense of loyalties, both as it relates to me being separated from my birth culture through adoption, and also through people trying to guess and figure out what I am and what they want to put me in the box of at the same time. So having conversations with our kids about bicultural identities is really impactful for our families. So I wanted to move on to the common traits of microaggressions. And this is really important to talk about. I think a lot of us sometimes we kind of get leery and tired of this conversation because we think in our heads, I already know what microaggressions are, right? I already have an idea what's going on here. But that doesn't mean that we can't be reminded of what microaggressions are, and of course, how to respond to them, how to advise families on how they might respond to microaggressions. So microaggressions often take shape and take form of dismissiveness of lived experience, right? So, well, they're not really going through it, like they don't really have it that bad. It's not really going on for them. Dismissiveness, that's not happening. There's also invalidation that goes on through comparison with other groups. And on the screen here, it says, there is no white privilege. I like to point out to parents that this often doesn't look like people saying necessarily there is no white privilege. It may look like I worked hard, I got a good education, I did everything I could. My family didn't have money. Therefore, what they say that they're going through, yeah, it might be kind of bad, but they need to buck up. They need to just do the work. They're not being discriminated against. There's no bias in our systems. They just need to work harder. So that's why it's important that we, of course, are continuing to read up on history to help them realize that, well, no, it's not just individual acts of racism that go on sometimes. These are some examples throughout history and throughout recent history of, redlining practices and housing discrimination, of in the 1940s in the GI Bill, when white World War II veterans were given housing resources, education resources that Black veterans, Latino veterans were not receiving when they came home. And so these things contributed not only to that generation, but the following generations, right, not having the same access to resources. We know that the 1940s was a time of growth in GDP for the United States, that people got richer, that the middle class expanded as we moved into the 50s and in the 60s. A lot of that had to do with the GI Bill and with our growth after World War II, but our communities of color were not receiving these things in the same way because of the discrimination and the racism that was existing in our systems throughout that era. And so these things are all things that we can talk to people about. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to say, oh, now I've changed my mind completely, right? We're not trying to change hearts and minds in a day or two. We're just trying to do our best in our small little piece of the world to educate others when we're hearing things like that. Some other microaggressions that we hear often are stereotypes that are based on race, that are based on preconceived notions. So these often take shape and take the form of, your boy is so articulate, right? So I think sometimes when we think of stereotypes, we think of negative stereotypes that we're thinking of, right? Things that we deemed negative. this person is lazy, that group is lazy. But especially for interracial adoptive families, there are going to be positive, quote, positive things that are said about our kids sometimes that are also microaggressions. Oh, your daughter is so beautiful. Her hair is so lush, right? We talked about hair earlier. Your son, like I said, is so articulate. I actually got that a lot when I was growing up. And that's not to dismiss myself and to say that, I didn't know how to speak. It's to say that I didn't hear extended family members of my adopted family saying that about other kids who were also, quote, articulate. So I was wondering, how come only I'm articulate? Are they surprised that I'm articulate or that I can speak? It seems like it's expected of the other kids who are not being told that they are articulate. And I'm witnessing this as I'm growing up. So that is also contributing in a lot of interracial adoptees to internalize racism, which is their sense of not feeling negatively about themselves and also their own racial groups too. And we'll talk about that. Another type of microaggression is stated dissociation. So I don't pay attention to that stuff. I don't watch the news. I don't care to watch it. It's not my thing, right? And the news may be about police brutality. The news may be about indigenous populations gaining more rights as it relates to adoption. And so sometimes we hear parents, adoptive parents say, well, I just don't watch the news. I don't think it's important. I want my child to not place emphasis on race. I want them to live in a colorblind household and know that we love them regardless. But if our parents don't see color, then they're not seeing the fullness of our child's identities. And if they're not seeing it's sometimes not only the discrimination, of course, that the child's racial groups have gone through sometimes throughout history, but also the beauty of their child's groups through watching the news, through watching programs, then they're also not seeing the fullness of their child's identities. And the child doesn't get to see that fullness either. The personal really is political for all of us. When we see news on TV that we feel relates to us, we feel more attached to it. If we're a new parent and we see a news story out there about a parent who has left their child in the car on a hot day, and that parent has had a 3-month-old, and we have a 3-month-old right now, we're going to think about ourselves. We're going to place ourselves in the shoes of that parent. We might feel more attached to this story than someone who maybe is not a parent themselves yet, who may care but isn't a parent themselves yet. So the stories that are going on that our children are often are going to feel more attached to are also things that we need to be paying attention to. And we'll talk about how to do that in just a second coming up. Another microaggression is being stuck in the comfort zone, right? Being stuck in, well, I really just form kindred spirits and friendships with people who look like me, who are the same faith as me. And that's just my comfort zone. It's not anything against anyone else. It's just who I am. It's just how I feel. But if we are not telling parents how important it is to have people over to the dinner table who obviously look like their kids, if we're not creating connections ourselves and telling parents that, I as a clinician, as a social worker, have made sure to be intentional about creating friendships with people who don't necessarily come from all these same markers of backgrounds as I do, because I want to get to understand a more diverse set of experiences. And it also helps me in my work with families, right? It also helps me understand how parents can do this too. I heard a really great example recently of a white adoptive parent of 2 Black children. And he's always been interested in books and reading. So he decided to join a literary book club that was a literary book club about Black authors. And so all of the books that they read were books by Black authors. And the group that he was in happened to have a lot of Black people in the group. And this was local at this time for him. So he decided to invite the members of the book club over to his house for a gathering to not only talk about the books, but to talk about life in general. And so his daughter, his son were able to see all of these different folks with different experiences, but who also shared the characteristic of a racial identity that was akin to the child's racial identity in the household. And he was able to do that in a way that really spoke to him because it aligned with his interests already. So allowing parents to know that you don't have to feel fake or phony about creating some of these things. Find things that are common interests for you. I recently told a mom, a white mom who happens to be Jewish, about the importance of making friendships with Sephardic Jews, so Jews of color. So making sure that, if you do feel like you're a kindred spirit with members of your same faith, being intentional about continuing to do that, but also finding members of your faith who are people of color too, so your kids can see that represented in faith and in the household. So addressing microaggressions. So sometimes we struggle with this because in the moment, right, we always think, oh man, I really just should have said this, or I could have said that. We're in the shower, we're in the car driving, the radio's going, and we just think, man, I really messed up this time. Well, no, you didn't. That's the first thing, is to have, forgive yourselves for not being as responsive in the moment as you wanted to be. And also know that in a lot of cases, especially if we're talking about interracial adoptive families, the microaggressions that they experience are often from actors and individuals that they know. So they will have a chance in a lot of occasions to address those microaggressions later on. But if they are happening in the moment, sometimes just saying stuff like, oh, that statement hit me kind of funny, is something that we have found can be helpful in talking about how we're thinking about dealing with microaggressions in the moment, because it invites conversation of, oh, well, why did that hit you kind of funny, right? Following up with, well, this statement I felt was problematic in certain ways because, and then someone said here, history is vital, tapping again back to that history point, tapping in history again, going to that, trying to come at it from an objective place in certain moments, and then in other moments, it may be helpful to say, I feel this way about this statement. Here's why I feel this way. My experience has taught me that this group does work hard. My experience has taught me that people of color are smart, or if it's gendered, that women are funny, right? That we even have microaggressions related to even things as small, right, as comedy. There's a microaggression that, well, women comedians are funny. It's only men who are funny. No, in my experience, I've watched stand-up comedians who are very, very funny who are women. So tapping upon our own experiences to kind of check those microaggressions in the moment. And also talk about the dangers of colorblind rearing strategies. And here I often tell a short story to interracial adoptive families. Some of you may already be familiar with this story of Alex Landau. So Alex Landau is a Black interracial adoptee with white parents. And when he was 19 years old, he was driving in his car. This is in Colorado, by the way. I saw someone say they're from Colorado here. He's driving in Colorado. He stopped. The police officer stops him and says, I smell marijuana in your vehicle. And Alex says, well, why did you stop me? And the cop says, well, some excuse, you were swerving, you were doing this or doing that. And Alex says, okay, what's the next step? And So the cop says, step out of the vehicle. So Alex questions and he says, why are you asking me to step out of the vehicle? And the cop says, basically, because I told you so. So Alex steps out of the vehicle, and then the cop says, we're going to search your vehicle. And Alex says, I don't want you to search my vehicle. There's nothing in there. There's no smell of marijuana. I don't even do drugs. I don't want my vehicle searched. And it was somewhere, in those particular moments that Alex then felt the cold blow of a black nightstick on his back. And he was hit where he fell to the ground. And Alex says that he continued to be hit while he was on the ground by the officer. And that the officer, while he was on the ground, while he was beating him, said to Alex, where's your warrant now, N-word? There did not end up being marijuana in the car, of course. Alex was given a ticket for resisting arrest or something like that, and let go. And Alex ended up in the hospital with broken cheekbones, broken ribs. And after this ordeal, they were talking to Alex's mother, the news was, and his mom, his white adoptive mom, said, I raised Alex in a colorblind household and it almost got him killed, is what she said. So there she was acknowledging that I just told Alex that he could talk to everyone the same way, that he would be treated fairly, that we didn't see race as a family, and so therefore other people wouldn't see his race or treat him in a discriminatory fashion because of his race. Unfortunately, this was not the case for Alex. And Alex's mom really learned that day, I need to do a better job. I needed to do a better job of talking to him, for example, about safety protocols when interacting with police, which we should be doing with all kids of all races. I need to talk to him about what to do if you are mistreated by a police officer. Get their badge number, right? Tell me. I'll go down to the station, make a formal complaint, which is what they ended up doing. Talk about the history of policing in the United States, and not to say that all police officers are bad, just to say that there is a racialized history that is existent here too, and to tell some of that story around, well, the first police forces were literal slave patrols that were police that were designated to find slaves, right? And throughout history, police force, the criminal justice system have interacted to enforce discriminatory policies, that we often see more policing in poorer areas. And because Black people, Latino people are disproportionately members of the impoverished, in part for those reasons, we see more policing in these areas, police looking for more things in these areas, and we see more mistreatment often in these areas. And in addition to that, we have individual police officers who have been caught saying racist things literally, on tape while driving on their dispatch. We have stories like Alex's, where he's being called the N-word when he's being beaten. So this is not to scare families. This is to help support them and to prepare them. But we also need, of course, to embrace the beauty of our kids' cultures, the pride that exists there too. And we need to balance these things out. So when talking about adoption, interracial adoption, it's also important for us as clinicians, as social workers, as adoption specialists, to understand and address the feelings around current events that exist for a lot of interracial adoptees. I'll give another example here. I was talking to an interracial adoptee who's a friend of mine who happens to be Asian, and we were talking, and this was after the shootings, the terrible shootings in Atlanta that happened a few months ago that killed 8 people, all Asian, in what was a hate crime, a targeted attack on salons in that area. And so, in thinking about that, I was speaking with her and she was saying, I don't feel, people keep sending me messages saying, I'm so sorry that this happened. How are you feeling? And she was saying, I kind of feel disassociated a bit from what happened because I don't feel, again, authentically, quote, Asian because of my experience as an interracial adoptee. My experience doesn't mean that all experiences are like that. But for a lot of adoptees, there are feelings that, well, yes, bad things are happening to Black people, but, and I feel bad, of course, but there's something that doesn't, I don't feel like as angry or as I don't feel as intensely about the situation as I feel I should. And so even these events that are going on can be triggering for this idea about racial authenticity that the interracial adoptee is feeling. And on the flip side of things, the interracial adoptee may feel intense, strong feelings about what happened to Asian people a few years ago, and what still goes on about negative words that are said about Latinx communities in relation to immigration, about not being true Americans. And sometimes the racist notions that they may see on the internet or in the communities that, well, we allowed you to live here. You need to earn your keep, earn your way. And they may feel to themselves, well, I want to express how I'm feeling, but I don't feel I can do that with my parents or with my extended family because they're not having those conversations themselves. So if I bring it up, then I'm othering myself in my household. So maybe I should just talk to my peers about this and be quiet about it in my home. I was told by an adoptive parent recently that during the protests around the murder of George Floyd last summer, that they were driving through DC. They were driving past the protest, and the Black boy who's around 13, 14 years old at the time was driving past, and his mom saw him looking at the protest, and it was kind of like his arm was kind of just twitching a little bit. It was twitching. And she was saying that she gave him permission to raise his fist up in those moments. She was saying that I told him it was okay to be in solidarity in front of me, that he didn't have to do it just with peers, with these racial mirrors, that he could do it in my household too. Right? So again, this idea that racial mirrors are not enough because we need to show our kids that we're not passing those conversations that they need to have about race to the person who is helping them with their homework who's Black, their soccer coach, their basketball coach, their gymnastics coach. That we as professionals, as adoptive parents, are also open to having those discussions with them. And someone said, there's also dual language. Be aware of propaganda that influences worldviews and perceptions of race and racial justice. History has been propagandized, making research and intentional and critical skills. So yes, being able to understand the balance that needs to come with these discussions, and to not give a propagandized version on either side of these discussions, but to talk about the experiences that people say that they have had, to hear the experience of Alex Landau, to hear about literal policies that were practiced, not to sit back and to say, these people are bad and these people are good, because we know it's way more complex than that. We're all trying as human beings, as individuals, to do better. And these are some ways that we can do better for our kids, for our families, and for people who are members of racial groups who have been treated unfairly throughout different points. And not only our nation's history, but throughout history in general. It's not blaming someone, it's saying, here's what we can do now. Listening to our kids and our families is important. So race and birth family connection. interactions with birth families sometimes make the interracial adoptee feel uncomfortable about juxtapositions of race, class, and their identities in relation to their adoptive status. So I was interacting with members of my birth family when I was growing up, and sometimes I came away from those interactions feeling as though, one, that I was of a different racial, not of a different racial group, but they had different experiences than I did growing up as a Black person. But also that certain members, not all members of my birth family, but certain members of my birth family had a different class experience that I also had growing up. And we have tied into our heads this notion that people of color are poor and that's part of their racial identity. It obviously isn't. But for the adoptee, for the interracial adoptee, sometimes there's also the feeling of, I quote, escaped poverty that's common amongst people who resemble my racial complexion. Therefore, even in the quote experience of being impoverished, I don't have that authenticity around that other individuals have. So allowing parents to acknowledge that class differences are not part of racialized identity differences, to separate the two out, and that there is nothing wrong with feeling guilty for certain things, but it is important to acknowledge for adoptees that they didn't do anything wrong, that they are not any less of their race because they grew up in a different class status. And of course, the education there too, right? Here are some middle and upper class Latinx people to look at. Here are some Black individuals. Here's a whole Black community of middle and upper class community here. So doing that in our own practice and educating them about class is also going to help with this authenticity issue that we see sometimes too. So quickly, I wanted to talk about racial mirrors because they are important still to have. I don't ever want to come across as saying that I'm downplaying the importance of racial mirrors, because kids need to have that. And how do we do that? Well, one way is to connect our children to mentors who share their ethnicities and racial backgrounds at school and in your communities. I gave the example of having a math tutor who resembles your kids. And for families who may be worried about the cost of that, there are lots of free and low cost tutoring programs that are out there in the United States where you pay $15 for an hour of tutoring. There are also free programs and scholarships that exist for kids for tutoring too. So educating our families about how they can reach out to those programs. Enlist the help of parents who share your child's races. So just asking, hey, what hair products do you use for your child? What lotions do you use for your kid? Not being afraid to ask those types of questions in this community style kind of raising children in general is going to be important. Creating space for your children to form friendships with children of other races is very important, and to be the ones reaching out on your own to do that. And if seeking clinical help, finding a therapist of your child's race when possible is also going to be something that we should be looking for. We may not always find it, but to try our best when we can to find that. And if we do not find a therapist of our child's race, if we're looking for that, to obviously have a therapist who's trauma informed, who's adoption trauma informed, and who also knows their stuff in regard to interracial adoptive families too, of course. I'm going to skip this next slide in the interest of time and move on to internalized racism. So a lot of adoptees, as I spoke about, have this sense of internalized racism, of not feeling authentic, yes, on the one hand, but then also saying, maybe I am one of the good ones, right? Or my race is ugly. I've had lots of Asian adoptees say, I hated looking in the mirror because I hated the way my eyes were shaped. I stretched my eyes literally to try to stretch them, and I hoped that I would wake up and my eyes would be more oval shaped and wider because I hated the way that it looked. I hated the way that people talked. These things happen a lot of times when kids are raised in colorblind households, because when our kids are learning to not talk about race, it doesn't mean that they're not learning about race in other places. It doesn't mean that they're not hearing negative stereotypes in other places. And so how do we examine that? And here we also have a great picture. This picture is from the doll test that was done with children. Children, I'm sure a lot of you may have heard of this experiment. Children were given a white doll here or a black doll to choose from. And research found that even at the toddler age developmental areas, that children were choosing the white doll and designating the black doll as ugly. And so even at that young age, they had internalized racism. And that was of kids who've grown up in same race families. So imagine also the even more the emphasis that needs to be placed on doing that work outside of that. And I want to address some of the questions in the chat. Obviously, we wish that we had all day or a series to talk about this stuff. I do have thoughts and opinions on MIPA, but again, in the interest of time, I'd like to move on, and maybe we can get to that in the question section of our stuff, as well as what can be done in the classroom. But in the classroom, it's important, of course, to have not only diverse stuff, but multicultural classrooms where we're checking the curriculums that the teachers are teaching from. And also, when we can, asking parents to observe classrooms to see, is my child being treated differently in relation to behavioral outbursts? Because we've seen that Black children, brown children are more likely to be suspended, expelled for the same infractions, school infractions, than their peers who are non-Black, non-Latinx individuals. So we are all human, and so this is really about helping children overcome internalized racism by having a diverse group of friends and racial mirrors, by talking positively about your child's birth family, complimenting their appearance, affirming the beauty of your child's racial groups, and reminding your child no race is a monolith. Watching TV shows, of course, is great. Reading books is great because they help us understand that the experience of a racial group are not monolithic, that they aren't the same, that someone may grow up in Georgia, someone may grow up in California, someone may grow up in Nebraska, and that all these experiences may be different. And so tapping into that. Now we can move to the next slide. So building a diverse community. So make a list of cultural museums. This is about helping families. How do we do this? Making a list of cultural museums, places to visit in your area. Those places don't have to be representative of the child's race all the time. So I'm in the DC area. So here we have the African American Museum, but we also have a Native American museum that's literally right across the street from the African American Museum too, that we'd also want to be encouraging families to go to, because we don't want to just learn about different racial groups as they just relate to our kids. We want to learn about different racial groups in general. And that also ties back to that bicultural piece, because we also want parents to be doing that work on themselves. I'm not aware of an Irish history museum, but if there was, we'd also want to take them there too, right? Another thing we can do is address, racial inequities, and we've kind of talked about that a bit, and address steps to address race-related issues in and around our community. One example is being proponents of community policing strategies in our own communities, of having school boards that are diverse school boards, of advocating for diverse teacher assignments in the schools where our kids are going to. Those are some ways that we can make an impact in a real way in our community. Inviting extended family to some of those gatherings, events that I talked about are also things that we can do. And connecting with other interracial adoptive families are also things that are very, very important for us to tell our families to do. The only person that truly gets my experience, right, in this world are often interracial adoptees, because they understand the multi-layered existence that I've walked, that they've walked. And so interacting with those families is important. And you can research ways to do that online, through camps, through support groups, and other things like that. If possible, I'm gonna skip that slide, Lisa, and I'm just gonna say, if possible, and thank you, I'm gonna say, if possible, having families move to a more diverse community is also something that's gonna be good, if they have the ability to, because then their kids will be able to get more of those racial mirrors, more of those diverse experiences, and won't feel as othered in their classrooms. So that's helpful. Travel to the places that the birth families are from too. If the birth family is from China or Korea, try to travel there. If the birth family is from Georgia, try to travel there. It's not just about international and traveling internationally, it's also about domestically. If they do have that information, then try to go to those places. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Tony, thank you so much. Just so rich and so much of value in all of that. I really, really appreciated your personal experiences, and I think a lot of our participants did as well. Again, just because we're closing in on our time here, I am going to move us along pretty quickly. Thinking about your experience of race, when we're talking about working with children and families in interracial adoption, and thank you so much for that, by the way, that language is really important, and I really appreciate that and the definition you gave us, Tony. So talking about what your experience was in a team meeting, for instance, or with your colleagues, and how has that influenced your work? So we really want to think about how our internal biases impact our work with kids and families, right? What negative beliefs or feelings towards specific populations you have. It's not only a barrier to working with them, but it's often uncomfortable for us as a child welfare provider or a mental health professional. We get uncomfortable and decide not to go in that direction. But we have to become more familiar with races or cultures that are other than our own, so that our kids can feel comfortable. And again, Tony, I love the idea of not only going to the Museum of African American History, but also Native American history, the Holocaust Museum, right across the street too. Really important perspectives to get to know what our world is about. We are a multicultural world. We're a global society, and we need to really pay attention to that. So what are the implications for practice? It matters how we think and see race, how we conceptualize bias, stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination. This all impacts our practice. We need to be able to accept the fact as professionals that race matters. It matters. We can't be colorblind. We can't be thinking that, I love everybody and color doesn't matter. The race doesn't matter. I don't hold any prejudices. Yeah, absolutely, we all do. It's part of humanity to categorize things. So that in itself is not a bad thing. But when we place judgment on that and make decisions for children, it's really important to know where we are and how to overcome our internal biases to work on behalf of children in the best way we can. Race matters. Race impacts children. We live in a race-conscious society. Tony, your stories about policing, where it comes from and how it's evolved, and what we're seeing most recently is something to be really, really paid attention to. Some things have changed. A lot has not changed. Institutional racism is real, and our kids and families need to know that. So Edna, do you want to talk about biases at work and just, again, kind of quickly move through this?
Yeah, we're going to move quickly through this, and thanks again, Tony. It's always so enlightening. I guess we could have listened to you for a couple of more hours, but let's put up a poll now. Want to get your thoughts and your feedback in terms of biases at work. So share with us, what are the biases that could affect your work as a child welfare professional? And some of you are also mental health professionals, so there's a wide variety. So it's a multiple choice. What are the biases that could affect your work as a child welfare or a mental health professional or a parent? If you can indicate those on the screen, it would be great. Feel free to use the chat box as well. And Deborah was saying, are you referring to biases that we have or the ones that we know affect? It could be either, but the ones that you have are the ones that we really want to focus on. And let's see where we are. All righty. So here are the key responses here. Quite a number of you talked about, well, you're pretty much all across the board in terms of all of these different biases. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. We talked about children and youth should only be placed with parents of the same race. All of these biases seem to be operationalized or ones that you have as professionals. So very varied, etc. And if, of course, there are others that you would like to share, please feel free to share those in the chat box as well, because we know that certainly there are other biases in operation in your work. So let's move on quickly. And this is just a question that you might want to pose to yourself or pose to your staff, and we won't be able to go into detail. But what assumptions are made based upon cultural miscommunication, the impact that it may have on children and families, and the assumptions that you probably need to challenge within that context? You feel free to, again, put those in the chat box. In working with your team, share times when maybe workers have made incorrect assumptions about behaviors of children. For example, in my previous work with substance abuse, it was always a note about Native American or American Indians who don't look at you in the eyes, that it's being dishonest or disrespectful, where it may be cultural, and it may be true for other cultures as well. So ask your staff, what can they do to check these assumptions? What about times when children on their caseload have been labeled by workers, parents, or teachers according to racial or cultural stereotypes? How do you address this? And in what ways can you mitigate the negative effect or the negative impact of this behavior on children? So feel free to put those in the chat box. We'd love to talk more about this, but in the time, we want to move forward. So during adolescence, the drive to gather information and fill in the missing pieces of one's story can be strong, and it's part of the task of identity formation. For the adopted adolescents, openness can make this journey a little bit easier by facilitating access to information. They always ask, these questions are asked, where did I come from? Where do I belong? Racial identity, cultural identity is important. Am I American, Asian, Chinese? What if I am something in addition to who I think I am? Maybe I'm Italian and not Hispanic. So this is another activity that you might want to use in your case management experiences. List 5 things adolescents could learn about their story from contact with their birth parents, their birth families, that might help them with identity formation. Let's keep moving, Lisa, so we can sort of cover these key points. You want me to keep going and we can close out? Okay, so racial identity and wellness, just another few key points. Examine the child's history to understand how they view themselves to help preserve their racial, ethnic, or cultural identity. And this will help to make the best placement decisions for them. Choose the most appropriate treatment options, also in choosing the most appropriate treatment options when they need the support of a mental health professionals. Let's keep it moving to the next slide. Here are some of the risk factors that we talked about previously. I don't need to go through all of these, and you'll be getting the slides. Here are some of the protective factors that we've reiterated over and over again as well. Let's move to the next one. Here's a focus on struggle with identity, some key points that you, again, might want to ask yourself or ask your staff in terms of the child's understanding of their race and ethnicity. What experiences are most pressing? How can you work with a child or parents to facilitate connections to others like her? So key questions or strategies. We talked about Anthony Peterson's TED Talk to launch a discussion about the construct of race. This is included in the module on race and ethnicity, module 4. So you'll definitely want to take a look at that. And it's a wonderful teaching and learning tool to work with your staff. Next slide, Lisa. So when you're talking about this whole particular aspect and construct, facilitate discussions with your staff, host open forums, and invite mental health partners to learn about diversity issues impacting children, youth, and families. We have so many resources in our training module you'll find that can help you. And of course, there's lots of materials on the Child Welfare Information Gateway. Lots of tools and resources. So here's what NTI does. Support children to heal from trauma and loss, provide parents with skills to parent more effectively, improving child and family well-being to increase family stability. And of course, today's focus was on race and diversity, but our training is so jam-packed with so much more. And we hope that you will definitely take an opportunity to take a look at the training, complete the training, and share the information with others. Next slide, Lisa. How do you access? You're interested in learning more? Here's our website about how you can learn more. Thank you, Gary, for putting that in the chat box. And here's just an example of how a module might look in terms of the actual training itself. So check out NTI. If you're taking NTI, continue to complete your modules. It's just such an excellent tool for you and your team. We've got more TOL Tuesdays coming up. The next one is in July, and we'll be going into depth talking about attachment, loss, and grief, and having 3 of our host sites from the state of Washington and here in Arlington County, Virginia, presenting. So be sure to join us again for upcoming TOL Tuesdays. What questions? I think, Tony, we had one. MIPA, was there a MIPA? I just want to make sure.
Yes, yes, and someone had asked a question about our thoughts and my thoughts on MIPA. As it relates to MIPA, I would say that obviously it's not a short conversation, but again, history and learning about that is really important because we know that MIPA is a policy that allows adoptive parents, interracial adoptive parents, to choose the race of the child that they would like to adopt. But as a policy that also at the same time doesn't allow birth parents to choose the race of the family that they would like to quote relinquish their child to in that regard. And there are arguments around, why that's so, but to really acknowledge how these processes are kind of in line with colorblind rearing strategies at times, with sometimes with problematic practice, and also about what we can do to support professionals as they adhere, obviously, in a legal sense to MIPA while acknowledging what we can do to improve child welfare systems across the United States at the same time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tony. Were there any other questions in the chat box that maybe I overlooked or comments that we might want to address?
So I see tips about how to explain why color blindness is detrimental. I actually think Tony did a pretty good job of explaining this. And I would say that we all see color. It's just a complete fallacy that we don't see color. If you look at, our faces on this, on our video here, you can see what color we are. Who's white and who's not white. It's just, we just know it, we see it. And it doesn't help to say everybody's the same. And I think that is hurtful to children. We don't see them for who they really are. When my kids are not seen as Korean, because they are Korean, it impacts their sense of self and their identity and how they are feeling belonging to a group. When I walked into my family reunion with my 2 Asian kids and everybody else is Italian, it's noticeable. You can see it. Tony, do you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, I feel the exact same way, Lisa. I actually don't have anything to add on to it. I think it's really impactful to acknowledge how harmful it can be and how erasing it can be to a child's identity. And as I said before, even if we don't live in a truly colorblind world, right? So even if the household is colorblind, doesn't mean that the school is colorblind, doesn't mean the community is colorblind, the church is colorblind, the football team, the soccer team, that these other places are colorblind places, even if we thought that was true of our household. So that's also why it's important that we have these conversations with our kids and with ourselves, with our partners, with our friends too, and adding on to that.
Yeah, for sure. And that, there are a lot of great activities built into the NTI. One activity that Edna and I have done often is How Diverse is Your Universe? It's a really great activity to sort of give you a representation, a visual representation of what your universe looks like. What are the different colors, if you will, in the cup? And it's a very eye-opening activity. I think that you'll enjoy it. There are a lot of activities that are built into the NTI, and which is, part of our promo for why we think this is such an important training. There are lots of things that you can go through, download, and use with kids and families the minute you look at it. It's free for using. It's everything is available for you to download, print, and distribute. We've gotten permission for all of it. So absolutely go in and use it.
Yeah. Next slide, Lisa. I don't know if that has the access information. Oh, that's our contact information, but do go to our website. You'll see a tab that says Access. You're able to access the NTI training through our CASE learning management system. So all of those instructions are there. And again, it's free, and the CEs are available if you go through our learning management system. Of course, we have folks on this webinar who are also hosting NTI on their own state or organizational learning management systems as well. And that's what Lisa and I do. We're implementation specialists who work with states to really assist them in implementing and integrating NTI. I think I have 23 states and Lisa may have 25, something like that. So we have states that we are assigned to, and we love working with you. So do contact us. We will be sending you a link, recording link to this presentation as well as the slides, and be sure to give us your feedback with the evaluation link as well. So again, thank you, Lisa and Tony. Thank you everyone for participating today, and we hope to see you at our next webinar on July 13th. So have a wonderful afternoon wherever you are. Bye-bye now.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.